Welcome to another video of these rhythm lectures, and in this episode I'm going to be discussing the concept of polyrhythms. These are perhaps one of the most interesting and exciting areas of rhythm, and especially coming from my point of view of a percussionist and a composer, polyrhythms and polyrhythmics make for the most interesting instances of rhythmic expression. The problem is they can be quite advanced, they can be quite difficult, can be quite misunderstood, and it can be a little bit daunting when you come to the topic of polyrhythms and trying to get your head around it. So in this video, I'm going to discuss a few broad topics. I'm going to discuss the topic of polyrhythms in general from a point of view of ratios. So I'm going to be returning to the topic of subdivisions, discussing ratios, 2 and 3 and more factor polyrhythms, the use of tuplets as polyrhythms, and finally a brief look at polyrhythmics in music in general, how we can apply polyrhythms without necessarily playing a full polyrhythm. So hopefully by the end of this episode, we will establish a clearer understanding of what we mean by polyrhythms, how they work, how they are constructed, and how they can be applied to music in some simple ways. Now, the word polyrhythm itself simply refers to an instance of multiple rhythms. However, as musicologists find, it can be very difficult to succinctly and correctly define the word polyrhythm. There are many definitions out there, and virtually all of them are technically correct and accurate, yet don't necessarily convey a great deal of information. Now, to show you what I mean, I have here a definition from Bob Becker, who is a phenomenal percussionist and composer in his own right, and produced a seminal piece of work entitled Rudimental Arithmetic, which is a combination of musicology and mathematics applied to the art of drumming. In it, he defines a polyrhythm as follows: an interrelationship of simultaneous groups of beats and/or groups of pulses that can be expressed by a ratio with 2 or more factors not equal to 1. Now that is an excellent definition. It is technically correct, factually accurate. However, it does not convey much information to somebody who doesn't understand the terms within it and doesn't understand what a polyrhythm is. In other words, if I gave that definition to one of my, let's say, 12-year-old students, they would probably be none the wiser as to what a polyrhythm actually is. That is not necessarily a shortcoming of the definition. It's an excellent definition. It just doesn't convey enough information out of context. So, by visiting some of the terms within that definition and clarifying what they mean, we can then revisit that definition and see if it gives us any more insight into what a polyrhythm is. So to begin with, we need to discuss this concept of ratios and the factors within a ratio, which Becker describes as not being equal to 1 within a polyrhythm. So what does this mean? Recently, I discussed the topic of subdivisions, and the subdivision is an equal division of the beat. Where a beat divides time, subdivisions divide the beat. Now, if we take a certain context to this, let's say the binary time signature of 4/4, where the beat is represented by 4 quarter notes per beat, a subdivision of 4 would be represented by 16th notes. There are, of course, 4 16th notes within a quarter note, so this, in context, represents a 4-note subdivision. Now, this can be represented by a ratio, 4 to 1. This ratio describes the 4 16th notes occurring for every one quarter note. In other words, there are 4 16th notes in the space of 1 quarter note. And as we will see later, this has connotations for tuplets. Now, this ratio in subdivisions is quite interesting. An 8th note subdivision in 4/4 would have a ratio of 2 to 1, a 2-note subdivision, 2 8th notes for every 1 quarter note. An 8th note triplet would have a ratio of 3 to 1, 3 8th notes for 1 quarter note. It doesn't matter the fact that it's a tuplet, the ratio simply describes x against y, x in the space of y. Now, there are some very interesting examples here. These subdivision ratios can become quite complex. For example, an 8th note quintuplet has a really odd ratio, 2.5 to 1. What does this mean? Well, an 8th note quintuplet places 5 8th notes in the space of 4. So ordinarily, these 4 8th notes would occur against 2 quarter notes. Now we have 5 8th notes occurring every 2 quarter notes. Now, because of the way that the 5 8th notes line up against the 2 quarter notes, we only get halfway through that quintuplet. In other words, we complete 2.5 8th notes for the first quarter note and 2.5 8th notes for the second quarter note. So the ratio becomes 2.5 to 1. 2.5 8th notes for every quarter note. An even more outlandish example, we can conceive of a ratio of 27:1 in a ternary time signature. Now, this is a bit of a head scratcher, but makes for a great thought experiment. Let's say we're in the time signature of 12/8, and we want to represent a 27-point subdivision, a subdivision with a ratio of 27:1. Now, this can't be achieved with normal means. There is no note value that can divide down to create a 27th of a dotted quarter note. So to achieve this, we have to use nested tuplets, and this is something I will explore on a different talk. But just for the sake of demonstration, if we want to derive a note value with a ratio of 27:1 against our dotted quarter note, we begin with a 16th note non-uplet. Now, this gives us 9 16th notes in the space of 6. So it's a simple tuplet that we talked about last time. 9 16th notes in the space of 6. Now, within this, we need to turn every one of those 16th notes into a 32nd note triplet. So these 32nd note triplets are nested in every 16th note of that non-uplet 16th note tuplet. Okay, now that is an absolute mouthful, and the graphics on screen will show you what this looks like. This is an interesting thought experiment, and it serves no real practical purpose except to show us how far we can take this concept of ratios. Now, armed with this definition of ratios, we can refer back to Bob Becker's definition of tuplets, interrelations or simultaneous occurrences of groups and beats with a ratio with 2 or more factors not equal to 1. Now, in every instance I have just suggested, 16th notes having a ratio of 4:1, 8th notes 2:1, even 8th note quintuplets with a ratio of 2.5:1 or 27:1, one of those factors is 1. So these do not meet the definition of a polyrhythm. In order for us to generate a polyrhythm, we need to have at least 2 factors, neither of which is equal to 1. So how can we achieve this? The simplest polyrhythm we can create is a 3 against 2. And this is the simplest because it is the first 2 numbers next to 1. They are the lowest prime numbers, and they are immediately next to the number 1 itself. So they represent the smallest polyrhythm that we can create. So polyrhythms, like subdivisions, can be expressed in terms of a ratio, except neither of them can be 1. So in our polyrhythm of 3:2, we can read this as 3/2 or 3 against 2, and the order doesn't necessarily matter. We could also reverse it to say 2/3 or 2 against 3. But we have 2 factors, one of which is a 3 and one of which is a 2. Now, to understand what these factors mean, we need to establish something called a resolution point. And the resolution point defines the length of one cycle after which it repeats and starts again. So, in the space of our 3 against 2, we can begin with the 3. It's arbitrary, we can begin with either, but for today we will begin with the 3. And we need to establish its resolution point. We need to establish where the 3 begins and where the 3 ends. Now, as discussed last time, anything to do with division implies an even spacing. So our polyrhythm with a factor of 3 against 2, when we tackle that factor of 3, it is implied that the 3 notes of that factor are 3 evenly spaced notes. So very simply, there is our instance of the factor of 3. Now, when we repeat this, we get a resolution point after which it starts again. And to see this, we quite simply count it. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All of those strokes are evenly spaced, and I am delineating it by emphasizing every group of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, this process is important because it defines the parameters of our polyrhythm. This is what defines it as a 3 instead of a 4 or a 2 or a 5 or anything else. Now, this emphasis, this determination of the resolution point defines the duration against which the second factor must be plotted. In other words, we've established how long it takes to produce the factor of 3. Now, against this, we need to produce the factor of 2, which is itself evenly spaced. Now, if we recall our talk last time about the subdivisions, when we are working within the same space of time, a higher subdivision is going to occur faster than a lower subdivision, and a lower subdivision is going to occur slower than a higher subdivision. In simple terms then, our group of 3 that we have just played is going to occur faster than the group of 2 because there are more notes. So in other words, our group of 2 that we are about to plot has to be slower than the group of 3 because within the same space of time, we are only playing twice as opposed to 3 times. So again, if we think in terms of our circle, if we divide that circle in half, those two resulting halves are going to be bigger than had we divided it into even thirds, and of course value determines duration. The greater the value, the greater the duration. So against this group of 3, I'm playing evenly 3 times. I need to play evenly twice to produce the second factor within the same time span. The easiest way to conceive this is against a common beat. So my leg here is essentially acting as the beat. At this point, it doesn't matter about note values. Don't conceive of this as a quarter note or anything like that necessarily. Let's just consider this as marking the resolution point. So against that, there's our grouping of 3. And we can hear quite clearly that factor of 3 on its own against its resolution point. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now against this same beat, my other hand needs to express the factor of 2. You can hear now there are 2 notes occurring evenly against the same resolution point. The duration of the beat is the same. So our polyrhythm is created when both of those things occur at the same time. There's our polyrhythm of 3/2. Now, because my beat here is occurring for every cycle of the whole polyrhythm, we could conceive that as a 3/2/1. Every 3 occurring at the same time as every 2 occurring at the same time as every 1. But that's redundant, essentially. That's implied and it is not necessary, and it does not feature in Becker's definition. In other words, that beat that I'm expressing with my leg here doesn't contribute towards the polyrhythm. That is there simply to demonstrate the cycle, one cycle, the resolution point. If I remove that, we can hear the polyrhythm on its own, 3 right hands against 2 left hands in the same span of time. And we can like a visual illusion, we can tune our minds to one or the other. So I can count the 3s, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or I can count the 2s, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. In both cases, the 1 occurs simultaneously. 1, 2, and 3, 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 1, 2, and 3. Now, the way I was just counting it there gives us some indication as to how we could import this into a metric context. The simplest way to do this would be to use the time signature of 3/4. Now, if you remember back to our talk on metrics, the time signature of 3/4 gives us 3 quarter notes to the bar, and each of those quarter notes represents the beat. So in simple terms, there are 3 beats to the bar. These 3 quarter notes represent the 3 factor of our polyrhythm. Within the cycle of 1 bar, there are 3 quarter notes occurring. So within that context, within the same bar of 3/4, we need to play a note value that occurs twice evenly within the space of 3/4. The value needs to be the same in total. Now, if we think of those 3 quarter notes in the bar of 3/4, we can divide those into 1/8 notes, such that there are 6 1/8 notes in total throughout the whole bar, 2 1/8 notes per quarter note. So in simple terms, we need to find another value of notes that combined adds up to the same 6 1/8 notes. The only way to do this in 3/4 is to use 2 dotted quarter notes. A dotted quarter note itself contains 3 1/8 notes, so 2 of them next to each other, there's the same 6 1/8 notes. So in our bar of 3/4, we have 3 quarter notes against 2 dotted quarter notes. Both contain the same value of 6 1/8 notes, but the emphasis points are different. In essence, this is playing a binary bar of 3/4 with 3 quarter notes at the same time as a ternary bar of 6 1/8 with 2 dotted quarter notes at the same time. And we can hear both of them. If you remove the emphasis points, the underlying 1/8 notes would be the same. Now I can choose to accent the groups of 3 the 3 quarter notes, I should say. Or I can choose to accent the groups of 3, the 2 dotted quarter notes. And we can hear again the individual factors of that polyrhythm on their own. So the polyrhythm occurs when those 2 factors occur at the same time. We have the factor of 3 occurring at the same time as the factor of 2, and our polyrhythm is established. Furthermore, the example I have just described of the 3 against 2 polyrhythm is what we would call, and I've described it as such, a 2-factor polyrhythm. This defines the 3 and the 2 individual factors which occur simultaneously. We can also conceive of a 3-factor polyrhythm or a 5-factor polyrhythm, or in theory, any number of polyrhythms, any number of factors to create a larger polyrhythm. In practical terms, the more factors they are, the more difficult and the more convoluted they become. They don't necessarily sound good from a musical sense unless they are voiced very, very clearly or cleverly or expressively. It can be very difficult to make a multi-factor polyrhythm sound pleasing or accessible to the ear. But that's not necessarily our concern here. But there are practical limitations as to higher order polyrhythms. Now again, to be in line with Becker's original definition, if we have a 3-factor polyrhythm, none of them can be 1. And the second thing we have to take into consideration is reducibility. It's no good describing a 6/4 polyrhythm when we can reduce that to 3/2. So we couldn't, for example, have a 6/3/2 3-factor polyrhythm, because that 6 is equivalent to the 3. Now, in Becker's work, there are examples that are drum specific of why we might define a polyrhythm as 6/4 instead of 3/2, and why we might have a 3-factor polyrhythm that goes 6/3/2. But they are really idiomatic to the drums and not strictly pertinent to the theory. So from a purely theoretical perspective, we tend to avoid reducible factors in our polyrhythms. That means we could have something like a 5/3/2. We've already got the 3 and the 2 established, and we would have an extra factor playing 5 times for every 3, for every 2. But to work out how a 3-factor polyrhythm would sound, we essentially multiply the factors together. 5 times 3 times 2. 5 times 3 is 15, times 2 is 30. So this gives us the minimum number of notes we need to occur in order to plot all factors of that polyrhythm. So the resolution point, the cycle of our 3-factor polyrhythm 5/3/2 is defined by 30 notes. It doesn't matter what those notes are, just think of them as the subdivision slot we talked about last time, a 30-note subdivision grid. So on this 30-note grid, we plot each factor based on its divisible to the number 30. 30 divided by 5 is 6. So we place the 5 every 6 notes of that 30. So across all 30 notes of our total cycle, that factor of 5 will be occurring evenly 5 times every 6 notes. The factor of 3 will be occurring every 10 notes, because 30 divided by 3 is 10. So that factor of 3 will be occurring every 10 notes. And the factor of 2 will be occurring every 15 notes. 30 divided by 2 is, of course, 15. So we can imagine this 30-note grid across the top. Every 6 of them is our factor of 5, every 10 of them is our factor of 3, and every 15 is our factor of 2. So in simple terms, that factor of 2 is defining the halfway point of our cycle. Now the 5 is going to occur most frequently, occurring every 6 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, etc., all the way to 30. The 3 is going to occur far less frequently. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, etc. And the 2, far less frequently, we would count all the way to 15 before playing our next stroke. Now in theory, if we had 3 limbs with 3 different voices and we counted to 30 and we voiced each of those factors every time it occurred, we would produce our 3-factor polyrhythm. Not really practical for individual musicians. This sort of approach is often often found in ensemble production, and even then it's used very sparingly. This brings us on then to the topic of tuplets. I hinted in that particular talk that tuplets are actually a discrete type of polyrhythm, and I was somewhat cryptic in that. So we are now better equipped to revisit that concept. You may recall that tuplets themselves have a ratio, much like the subdivisions we've discussed and the polyrhythms we are discussing now. So our ratio of something like a quintuplet might be 5 to 4, which reads in the sense of a tuplet 5 in the space of 4, and it refers to the note value in which we find in the tuplet. So if we are dealing with a 16th note quintuplet, it is stating there are 5 16th notes in the space of 4, and this is written as a ratio, 5 against 4. And we can start to see here how this defines a polyrhythm, just like a two-factor polyrhythm, 5 against 4. The issue with tuplets is that the second factor, the 4, is implied. So these are implied polyrhythms rather than explicitly expressed polyrhythms. We have the 5 notes of the quintuplet occurring as a 5-to-1 ratio against the quarter note, but they are also implied against the 4 notes of the 16th note native subdivision as it occurs natively. So we have to kind of conceive of a quintuplet as an implied polyrhythm, with the 5 notes of the quintuplet occurring over the implied native 4-note subdivision. Now, that doesn't necessarily change the way we voice a quintuplet in practical terms, but it does give us some theoretical Play-Doh to play with in terms of how we think of a quintuplet and how we think of a tuplet generally and how we think of a polyrhythm. This brings us on to the last topic I want to discuss today then, which is the concept of polyrhythmic music. Polyrhythmic music and polyrhythmics in general describes the use of polyrhythm in the rhythmic expression of music without necessarily needing to voice an entire polyrhythm. So this takes us back first of all to the concept of resolutions and cycles. Now, in my previous example, I defined a 3 against 2 polyrhythm as occurring within a bar of 3/4, whereby the 3 is indicated by the 3 notes of the quarter note, right? Now, I'm going to take a different example here to show you what I mean. I'm going to take a 5 against 4 polyrhythm. Now, we can follow the same process to build this 5/4 polyrhythm. I'm going to begin in the time signature of 5/4, and the 5 quarter notes of that time signature define the factor of 5 in our 5 against 4 polyrhythm. So that means our first factor is very simply the 5 beats of the bar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, the easiest way, coming from a drummer's perspective, to voice the 4 factor that we are looking for is to use accented 16th notes. So, against those 5 notes of the bar, I'm simply going to play 16th notes. 1E under, 2E under, 3E under, 4E under, 5E under. Those 16th notes themselves have a factor of 4 to 1 against the beat. Now, to achieve the factor of 4 we are looking for, I am going to accent every 5th stroke. So on its own, I'm simply playing this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm simply playing strokes and I'm accenting every 5th one. Within the context, against those 5 notes of the beat, it's going to sound like this. 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and 5E and. By the time I got to the 5th beat, I have finished 4 accents. And there's one resolution. There's one cycle of the 5 against 4. 5 beats for 4 accents. And then we start again. So to hear that, I'm going to play the first note on a different sound effect so you can hear every time it starts again. So at this stage, I am simply repeating a bar of 5/4. I'm playing 5 quarter notes to the bar, I'm playing 16th notes, and I'm accenting every 5th 16th note, and the accents produced are the factor of 4 from our polyrhythm. So we have 5 beats for every 4 accents, or 4 accents for every 5 beats, and both factors are evenly spaced. This is not particularly polyrhythmic because it's condensed to 1 bar. So it becomes far more interesting when we take this out of our time signature of 5/4 and place it into a different time signature. So to hear this, I will play it in 4/4 this time. I'm going to play it and feel it in the same way, except I'm only going to count to 4 quarter notes per bar instead of to 5. And what we will find is by the time I get to the end of the 4th beat and then start again from 1, I've not finished the polyrhythm. So it rolls over into a second bar. And it's going to take me 5 full bars of 4/4 before the whole cycle starts again on the first beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. I counted 5 bars of 4/4 and the polyrhythm starts again. Now the idea of polyrhythmics in music treats that polyrhythm as like a moving train between 2 destinations. Each time the train is doing a full circuit of the whole polyrhythm. Now we as musicians, whether that be composers or performers, can hop onto that train, ride it for some of the way, and then hop off again. Now, if we start hearing that polyrhythm as a musical phrase, forget the resolution point, just listen to the interaction between the accents and the beat. That is the full polyrhythm voiced explicitly. Now, we don't have to play all of that to express that same polyrhythmic idea. I could be improvising or playing a passage in 4/4 and I hint, imply, suggest that polyrhythm without having to play all of it. I could go on. And what I'm actually playing is not important. What was important there is some of the time my ideas were expressing some of those accents against the beat, which if we plotted them in their entirety would define that 5/4 polyrhythm. I was sometimes doing a 3/2 as well. 1, 2, da, 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 which was more frequent, occurs more frequently. So the idea of polyrhythmics in music is to suggest some of these polyrhythms without necessarily having to voice the entire thing. An entire polyrhythm is kind of like a really long, unwieldy thing. We don't want to use it in its entirety. We just want to take musical, expressive chunks of it and suggest those within our music. And that is really the concept of polyrhythmics generally, to express polyrhythms in a musical way without being bound to the entire cycle. So to close then, we can return to Becker's definition, which defines a polyrhythm as an interrelationship between ratios having factors none of which are equal to 1. It doesn't matter how many we use, as long as none of them are equal to 1 and none of them are reducible. So if we take our factor of 3/2, our polyrhythm of 3/2, we've got a factor of 3 occurring simultaneously with the factor of 2. We have 3x for every 2y, or 2x for every 3y, and those occur simultaneously within the same cycle. Now, usually that cycle is defined by the beat, but it doesn't have to be. But in all instances, the polyrhythm is going to define the beat somewhere. There is going to be a representation of the beat as one of those factors. So when you have a 2-factor polyrhythm, one of those factors will be the beat. When you have a 3-factor polyrhythm, one of those is going to act as the beat. You've got to have some foundation on which to layer the factors. So if we've got our 3/2, we can have our 3 on the bottom defined by the 3 quarter notes and then have the 2 dotted quarter notes on top of it. It needs that factor of 3 underneath on which to place the factor of 2. We can, of course, switch it, so the 2 dotted quarter notes are on the bottom. It doesn't really matter, but for all intents and purposes, one factor of the polyrhythm is always going to represent the beat. If it doesn't, we might be implying a higher factor polyrhythm than we imagine. We've always got to have that beat in there somewhere. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I hope this has given you some things to think about with polyrhythms. One final thing I'd like to say, which I have neglected to mention so far, comprehensive lecture notes for all of these talks are available on my website. So if you'd like to revisit these topics and read through them and look at the diagrams at your leisure, the links are in the description and you can access, as I say, comprehensive lecture notes of all of these talks. So thank you very much. I really hope you are enjoying these and get something out of them, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.